Tonight, we're going to explore something that is rarely discussed honestly. Tonight, we're going to understand what marriage was really like for Victorian women. We're going to move beyond the romantic ideals and the beautiful weddings and step into the reality of married life. When we think about Victorian marriage, we often see white dresses, flowers, carriages, and the promise of happily ever after. Popular novels of the era often ended with marriage as a romantic conclusion. Marriage was presented as a triumph, the achievement, the fulfillment of a woman's life. But the reality beneath these images was very different. The reality was a story of legal subordination, physical vulnerability, emotional isolation, and profound constraint. The reality was often a story of suffering that was endured in silence. Let yourself become completely comfortable. Your body should feel fully supported and relaxed. Feel yourself sinking into comfort as we begin this journey into the hidden truth of Victorian marriage. Breathe slowly and deeply. With each breath, you're becoming more relaxed, more open to understanding the true experience of Victorian women who lived through marriage in this era. Imagine yourself stepping back in time to a Victorian wedding. There's a young woman in a white dress. The dress is beautiful and expensive. Her hair has been carefully arranged. Flowers have been woven into her hair. She looks perfect. She looks like the picture of happiness and hope. She has been taught her entire life that this moment is her destiny. From childhood, she has been prepared for this moment. She has been taught that marriage is a purpose, that becoming a wife will fulfill her, that marriage is a gateway to adult life and to respectability. But what she doesn't know, what no one tells her, is that the moment she says, "I do," everything changes. The moment she says, "I do," she will cease to exist as a separate legal person. She will become the property of her husband in a very real and very legal sense. The ceremony concludes. Bells ring. Guests celebrate. The couple leave for their honeymoon. The bride is now a wife. But she doesn't yet understand what this means. The most shocking truth about Victorian marriage is that it was essentially a legal death for women. The legal principle that governed this was called coverture. It meant that upon marriage, a woman's legal existence merged with her husband's. In the eyes of the law, the wife did not exist as a separate person. The husband and wife were legally one person, and that person was a husband. Before marriage, if a woman was unmarried and of legal age, she had genuine rights. She could own property. If her father left her money or property, that property belonged to her. She could sign contracts. She could control her own money. She could decide how to spend her earnings. She could make decisions about her own life. A single woman had independence and autonomy. A single woman could work if she chose to. A single woman could move about the world without male permission. But the moment she married, all of this changed. Everything changed. Any property she had owned before marriage became her husband's property. If she had inherited money from a relative, that money now belonged to her husband. If she had received money from her father, that money was now the husband's. If during the marriage she inherited money or property from a relative, that inheritance belonged to the husband. The wife had no claim to it. If the wife earned money through her own work, that money belonged to the husband. She could not keep her own wages. Everything she earned was a husband's. The husband had complete and total control over all family resources. The wife had to ask permission to spend money. In some households, the wife might be given a small allowance for household expenses or for personal necessities, but this money wasn't truly hers. It was given to her as if she were a child receiving an allowance. The husband could take it away at any time. A woman who had been a wealthy heiress before marriage could find herself dependent on her husband for spending money after marriage. She might have to ask for money to purchase a new dress. She might have to ask for money to visit a friend. She might have to ask for money to make a charitable donation. The humiliation of this dependence was profound. If a woman wanted to start a business before marriage, she could do so. She could be an entrepreneur. She could own a shop. She could earn money from her business. But if she married, her business would become her husband's. The husband would control it. The wife would have no legal claim to it. All of her work, all of her intelligence, all of her effort, all of her risk-taking would legally belong to her husband. The wife had no legal claim to anything in the household. Not to the house they lived in. Not to the furniture in it. Not to the clothes on her back. Not to her own jewelry. Not to her personal belongings. Everything belonged to the husband legally. If the husband wanted to sell the furniture or the house, he could do so. The wife had no say in it. If the husband wanted to give away the wife's clothes or her jewelry to someone else, he could do so. The wife could not stop him. If the husband died, the widow would inherit only what he left her in his will. If he left nothing to her, she would inherit nothing. The property might go to the eldest son. The wife might be left with nothing. This was the legal reality of Victorian marriage. The wife legally ceased to exist as a separate person. Some reforms began to happen in the second half of the Victorian era. The Married Women Property Acts of 1870, 1874, and 1882 in England gave married women some limited rights to property they owned or inherited after marriage. These acts were revolutionary. They were the first time that married women were given any legal rights to property. But even with these acts, married women were still fundamentally subordinate. The acts allowed women to own property, but the husband was still the head of the household. The husband still had ultimate authority. The wife still could not vote. Women would not gain the right to vote until the 20th century. She still could not serve on a jury. She still could not hold public office. She still had no legal guardianship rights over her children without her husband's permission. If the husband died, the children would go to a male guardian, not necessarily to the mother. A married woman was a legal ghost. She existed physically. She was alive. She breathed. She thought. She felt. But legally, she did not exist as a separate person. She was an appendage of her husband, an extension of his legal identity. This legal non-existence was the foundation of everything else that was wrong with Victorian marriage. It was a legal mechanism through which women's subordination was maintained and justified. When a wife objected to something her husband did, she had no legal standing. When a wife wanted to protect her own interests, she had no legal right to do so. When a wife wanted to make a decision about her own life, she had no legal authority. The law itself made her subordinate. The law itself made her powerless. The law itself made her dependent. The wedding ceremony was a public celebration. The community gathered to celebrate the union. The bride's family gave a reception. There was music and dancing and the consumption of expensive food and wine. But as evening fell and the guests left, something very private was about to occur. The bride had been given almost no information about what would happen on her wedding night. Sex was not discussed with unmarried women. Information about sexuality was considered to be indelicate, inappropriate, potentially corrupting for a respectable young woman. Some brides were told vaguely that they should be good wives and that they should do their duty, but the specific meaning of this was left to the imagination or to discovery. When the bride and groom were finally alone in the bedroom, the bride might have felt fear or confusion or shock. Some brides did not understand what was about to happen. Some brides understood only vaguely. And then the groom made his sexual expectations clear. What happened next was, by modern standards, a violation. But by Victorian standards, it was a husband's right. The law said that a husband had the right to sexual relations with his wife. A wife could not refuse. A wife had no legal right to her own body. If a husband forced his wife, this was not a crime. There was no such thing as marital rape. The law did not recognize that a husband could rape his wife. The law considered sexual relations to be the husband's right, and the wife was obligated to submit. Some women experienced the wedding night as a shock. A bride might have expected tenderness or consideration. Instead, she experienced her husband's crude passion. Some women felt fear. Some women felt revulsion. Some women felt pain. And yet the wife was expected to accept this without complaint. The wife was expected to submit. The wife was expected to become pregnant. The expectation was that a wife would be pure, virtuous, and above sexuality. Yet the wife was also expected to fulfill her husband's sexual desires. Yet the wife was not supposed to show pleasure or desire. Yet the wife was supposed to be available and willing. This contradiction was at the heart of Victorian sexuality and Victorian marriage. A woman was supposed to be a lady, delicate, modest, pure. A woman was not supposed to be interested in sex. A woman who showed sexual interest or who enjoyed sexual activity was considered to be coarse or immoral. Yet a woman was also supposed to fulfill her husband's sexual desires. A woman was supposed to submit to her husband's advances whenever he desired them. A good wife was one who did her duty without complaint. A good wife did not resist her husband. A good wife did not question her husband. A good wife submitted silently. Many women described the marital duty as an ordeal, a trial, an unpleasant obligation that had to be endured. Some women developed physical symptoms in response to the stress of forced sexuality. Some women experience pain during intercourse. The pain might have been due to tension or fear or actual physical injury. Some women became ill or developed weakness or exhaustion from the emotional stress of the marital duty. Some women developed complete aversions to sexual activity. The thought of being touched by their husbands would cause them anxiety and distress. Physicians would sometimes attribute these symptoms to hysteria or nervousness. They would suggest that the woman was imagining her suffering or was exaggerating. They would not recognize that the woman was experiencing trauma from being forced into sexual activity against her will. Some women attempted to avoid sexual relations by feigning illness. A woman might claim to have a headache or to feel unwell, but a husband could often force a relations regardless of the wife's claimed illness. Some women would resist their husbands. A woman might try to refuse, but she had no legal right to refuse. If she resisted, the husband could force her. If she resisted, she was considered to be disobedient and ungrateful. The marital duty continued throughout the wife's reproductive years. As long as a woman was capable of becoming pregnant, she was expected to be available to her husband. The marital duty also continued after a woman was past her reproductive years. Even an older woman, even a woman who could not become pregnant, was still expected to submit to her husband's sexual desires. For many Victorian women, the marital duty was one of the most traumatic aspects of marriage. The woman's body was treated as property. The woman's consent was not sought or considered. The woman's suffering was ignored or was blamed on her. If the marital duty resulted in pregnancy, the woman entered into a 9-month ordeal that could easily end in her death. Pregnancy in the Victorian era was dangerous. Women died from complications of pregnancy and childbirth at rates that are almost incomprehensible to modern people. Every pregnancy carried with it the very real possibility of death. A woman knew this. A woman understood that when she became pregnant, she might not survive the birth. Pregnant women received no prenatal care. There were no routine checkups. There was no monitoring of the pregnancy. A woman would not see a doctor until she went into labor, and sometimes not even then. A pregnant woman had no reliable information about what was happening to her body. She did not understand the physical changes that were occurring. She had no guidance about how to maintain her health during pregnancy. As the pregnancy progressed, the woman's body would change in ways that were uncomfortable and sometimes distressing. She would gain weight. Her body would swell. She would feel heaviness and exhaustion. She might experience nausea and vomiting, particularly in the early months of pregnancy. She might feel weakness and fatigue. She might experience various aches and pains. She would be aware that her body was no longer her own. Her body was being used to create a new life. Her body belonged to the fetus as much as to herself. The pregnant woman was expected to hide her condition as long as possible. She would wear loose clothing to disguise her pregnancy. The pregnancy was considered to be indelicate, something that should not be visible or discussed. In polite society, pregnancy was not openly acknowledged. A pregnant woman would not appear in public if she could help it. The pregnancy was something that happened in the privacy of the home. As her pregnancy advanced, the woman would restrict her activities. She would spend more time at home. She would reduce her participation in social events. She would become increasingly isolated. The woman would experience anxiety as she awaited the birth. She would wonder if she would survive. She would think about her children who depended on her. She would make preparations for the birth, knowing that she might die. When the time came to give birth, the woman would endure labor at home. The pain would be intense and would last for hours, sometimes for days. There was no effective pain relief available. Chloroform was sometimes used as an anesthetic, but it was not always available and was not always safe. A woman in labor would experience agony. The pain would come in waves. The pain would be relentless. The actual birth was dangerous. Women died from bleeding. Women died from infection. Women died from complications of anesthesia. Women suffered tearing and injuries that never fully healed. Some women suffered injuries so severe that they could never have another child or could never have normal sexual relations again. If the birth went well, the woman would be left weakened and exhausted. The recovery would take weeks or months. She would be vulnerable to infection and to various complications. Childbed fever was a common and often fatal infection that occurred after childbirth. A woman recovering from childbirth could suddenly develop a high fever and would die within days. There was no effective treatment for childbed fever. But the ordeal did not end with one pregnancy. Most Victorian women became pregnant repeatedly throughout their reproductive years. A woman who married at 20 might have 10, 12, or even 15 children by the time she was 40. The pregnancies would come one after another, year after year. Each pregnancy would weaken the woman further. Each birth would damage her body more. The cumulative effect of repeated pregnancies and childbirths would be devastating. Women would develop chronic health problems from the cumulative damage. A woman in her 40s who had borne many children would be in poor health. The woman would be exhausted and worn. A woman's teeth would often deteriorate after multiple pregnancies. The fetus would draw calcium from a mother's teeth and bones. A woman might lose her teeth by middle age. A woman's body would be damaged internally. The uterus would be weakened. The vagina would be stretched and torn. The pelvic floor would be damaged. A woman might develop prolapse, in which a uterus would literally fall into her vagina. A woman would experience chronic pain. A woman would experience weakness and exhaustion. A woman would be susceptible to illness. Some women attempted to limit the number of children they had. Women would try various unreliable methods of contraception. Women would use douches. Women would use sponges. Women would use condoms that were not very reliable. Most of these methods had limited effectiveness. Many women who tried to prevent pregnancy still became pregnant. Some women would attempt to induce miscarriage if they became pregnant when they did not want another child. This was extremely dangerous. Women would take medications that were supposed to cause miscarriage. Women would do things to their bodies that were traumatic and often resulted in serious injury. Some women became sexually withdrawn from their husbands in an attempt to avoid further pregnancy. A woman might avoid her husband's sexual advances. A woman might try to refuse him. But a husband would often force sexual relations regardless of the wife's wishes. A husband had a legal right to sexual relations. A wife had no right to refuse. The fear of pregnancy was constant for many Victorian women. A woman who was sexually active lived with the fear that she might become pregnant. The fear would be present all the time. The fear would be overwhelming. Some women lost children to stillbirth or to infant mortality. The death of a child was devastating. A mother who had carried a child for 9 months and expected to give birth to a living baby would be traumatized by the loss. Some women experienced repeated miscarriages. The cumulative effect of multiple losses, combined with the physical trauma of each miscarriage, created profound suffering. The combination of the physical danger of pregnancy and childbirth, the emotional stress of repeated pregnancy, the fear of death, and the loss of children created suffering that was largely invisible and was rarely discussed openly. Women endured this in silence. Women did not complain. Women did not question why their bodies had to endure this repeated trauma. Even before the woman became pregnant, even on the very first day of her marriage, she had already taken on the overwhelming responsibility of managing a household. The household was the wife's domain, and the wife was entirely responsible for its functioning. This responsibility was total and all-consuming. In a wealthy household, the wife would have servants to do the physical labor. But the responsibility was on the wife. The wife had to oversee the servants. The wife had to make sure that the work was done properly. The wife had to manage the household's operations. Every morning, the wife would wake and would have to think about the day ahead. There was always something that needed to be done. There was always some aspect of the household that needed attention. The wife would plan the meals for the household. The wife would consult with the cook about what should be served. The wife had to ensure that the meals were appropriate for the family's station in society. A wealthy family would have to serve elegant meals. A middle-class family would have to serve respectable meals. The meals had to reflect the family's status. The wife would have to understand nutrition, though not in a scientific way. The wife had to know what foods were appropriate, what foods were healthy, what foods would be appealing. The wife would manage the purchasing of supplies and the shopping. The wife would know what the household needed. The wife would arrange for the purchasing of food, of fuel, of clothing, of all the supplies that a household required. The wife had to work within a budget provided by the husband. If the wife exceeded the budget, the wife would be criticized. The wife would be told that she was wasteful or extravagant. The wife would oversee the cleaning and the maintenance of the house. The wife would make sure that the furniture was properly maintained. The wife would make sure that the house was clean and tidy. The wife would make sure that everything was in order. The wife would supervise the laundry and the mending of clothing. The wife would make sure that all clothing was properly cared for. The wife would make sure that the family had clean clothes to wear. The wife would be responsible for the decoration and the furnishing of the house. The wife would choose the furniture, the colors, the decorations. The wife would create the aesthetic environment of the home. In the early morning hours, sometimes before dawn, the wife might wake and would inspect the rooms. The wife would walk through the house and would make sure that the servant had done their work properly during the previous day. The wife would note what needed to be done. Throughout the day, the wife would be checking on various aspects of the household. The wife would go to the kitchen to speak with the cook. The wife would inspect the rooms. The wife would make decisions about various household matters. The wife had to be knowledgeable about many things. She had to understand how to manage servants. She had to understand how to keep a household budget. She had to understand how to plan nutritious meals. She had to understand how to maintain order and cleanliness. Despite all of this knowledge and skill, the wife's work was considered to be unskilled and was not valued. The work was simply expected. If the household ran smoothly, the wife would receive no special recognition or thanks. If something went wrong, the wife would be blamed. In a middle-class household where there were fewer servants, the wife would do some of the physical work herself. The wife might prepare some of the meals. The wife might do some of the cleaning and the mending. In a working-class household, the wife would do all or most of the physical labor herself. The wife would cook all of the meals. The wife would do all of the cleaning. The wife would do all of the laundry and the mending. The wife would work very long hours. The wife's work would be backbreaking. Regardless of class, the wife was responsible for making sure that the home was a pleasant place for her husband and her children. The home was supposed to be a refuge from the outside world, a place of comfort and peace. The wife was supposed to create this refuge. If the home was not pleasant, the wife was blamed. If there was discord or unhappiness in the home, the wife was blamed. The wife was expected to be always available to meet the needs of her family. If a family member needed something, the wife would provide it. The wife would interrupt whatever she was doing to attend to the needs of others. The responsibility for the household was constant and never-ending. A wife would work from early morning until late at night, managing all aspects of the home. The wife would wake early to oversee the servants and to make sure that the household was prepared for the day. The wife would work throughout the day, attending to various household matters. The wife would work into the evening, making sure that the household was prepared for the night. The wife would have little free time. Perhaps on Sunday, there might be a few hours when the wife could rest or could engage in leisure activities. But even on Sunday, the wife was expected to be available to her family. The work was often invisible. The husband and the children would not acknowledge the work or thank the wife for it. The work was simply expected. The work was something that the wife was supposed to do. The wife's entire life revolved around meeting the needs of others. The wife had little time for her own needs or her own interests. The wife's education, her talents, her potential, all of these would be subordinated to the needs of the household. Beyond the demanding work of the household, the wife faced severe constraints on her freedom and her independence. A wife could not go out alone. A wife had to be accompanied by her husband or by an appropriate chaperone, usually an older female relative or a trusted servant. An unaccompanied woman in public would be subject to gossip and judgment. People would talk about her. People would question her reputation. A woman seen alone in public would be assumed to be up to no good. This restriction meant that the wife's ability to move about the world was severely limited. The wife could not go to work outside of the home, even if she wanted to. A wife could not attend certain public events or gatherings without a male escort. A wife could not travel alone. If the wife wanted to visit a family who lived in a distant town, she could not go alone. She would have to arrange for her husband to take her, or she would have to arrange for a family member to accompany her, or she would have to forfeit the visit. A wife could not visit friends unless it was arranged with a husband's approval and with an appropriate chaperone. The wife was confined to the domestic sphere. The wife's world was limited to her home and to the approved social activities. The wife's world was small. A wife could not participate in the public life of her community. A wife could not attend political meetings or public debates. A wife could not engage in any public activities. Some wives felt deeply trapped by these restrictions. Some wives wanted the freedom to do things on their own. Some wives wanted to go where they wanted to go and to do what they wanted to do. But they were not permitted to do so. A wife could not make friends with whom she wanted. The wife's social circle was determined by the husband's position and the family's station in society. The wife would socialize with women from similar families and similar backgrounds. A wife might long for friendship with a woman from a different background, but such a friendship would be considered inappropriate. A woman from the working classes would not be a suitable friend for a woman from the upper or middle classes. A wife could not participate in activities outside of the home that required independence or decision-making. A wife could not pursue education. Even though education was becoming more available to women as the Victorian era progressed, a married woman would likely not have the freedom to pursue it. A husband might forbid his wife from attending lectures or from taking classes. A wife could not develop her talents or pursue her interests if the husband did not approve. If a wife had a talent for art or music or writing, she could only pursue these talents if her husband allowed it, and if she had time after all of her household duties were completed. A wife could not control her own money. Even if the wife wanted to spend money on something, the wife would have to ask her husband for permission. The wife would have to use the small spending allowance that the husband allowed her. The isolation meant that a wife's entire life was lived in relation to her family. The wife's thoughts and her time were devoted to the welfare of her husband and her children. Some wives accepted this isolation as a normal state of affairs. These wives did not question their confinement or their lack of autonomy. These wives believed that this was how life was supposed to be for women. Other wives chafed against the isolation and the restrictions. These wives wanted more freedom and more control over their own lives. These wives experienced the constraints as a form of imprisonment. Some wives attempted to push against the boundaries. A wife might ask to attend a lecture or to visit a friend more often, but the husband could always deny the request. Some wives found ways to create a sense of autonomy and independence within the constraints of their lives. Some wives would volunteer for causes that the husband approved of. Some wives would find ways to pursue their interests within the home. Some wives would correspond with friends and relatives and would find some connection and companionship through letters. Some wives would develop deep friendships with other women. These friendships might be the primary source of emotional support and connection for the wife. A wife might confide in a close female friend about her unhappiness or her struggles. The isolation of many Victorian wives was a source of significant suffering. A woman who felt lonely or who wanted more freedom and more autonomy had no way to change her circumstances. The wife could not escape the isolation. The wife could not break the constraints. The wife had to endure. At the center of all of this was a relationship between the wife and her husband. The relationship between husband and wife was characterized by the dominance of the husband and the subordination of the wife. The husband was the head of the household and had authority over all members of the household, including his wife. This was not merely a matter of custom or tradition. This was a law. The law gave the husband authority. The law made the wife subordinate. The husband controlled the money and made financial decisions. The husband decided how much spending money the wife would receive. The wife had to account for how she spent the money. Some husbands would demand to know exactly what their wives had purchased and why. Some husbands were generous with their wives' spending allowances. These husbands would give their wives a reasonable amount of money to spend on household expenses and on personal items. Other husbands were stingy and provided their wives with only minimal amounts of money. These husbands would watch their wives spending carefully and would criticize them for spending too much or for spending money on unnecessary items. A wife who wanted to make a purchase had to ask her husband for money. If the husband refused, the wife could not make the purchase. The wife could not buy a new dress if her husband did not approve. The wife could not purchase a book if her husband did not approve. The husband made decisions about where the family would live. The husband decided if they would move to a new house or new city. The wife had no say in this decision. The husband made decisions about what activities a family would participate in. The husband decided if the family would travel or if they would stay home. The husband decided if the children would attend school or if they would be educated at home. The husband decided what social obligations a family would fulfill. The husband decided what social events they would attend. The husband decided how much entertaining they would do. If the wife disagreed with the husband's decisions, she had no power to change them. The husband's decision was final. The wife had to accept it. The quality of the marriage depended largely on the character of the husband. Some husbands were kind and treated their wives with respect. These husbands would listen to their wives' opinions and would consider their wives' preferences. Other husbands were harsh and treated their wives with contempt. These husbands would belittle their wives and would criticize them. Some husbands were interested in their wives' opinions and valued their company. These husbands would spend time with their wives and would engage in conversation with them. Other husbands had little interest in spending time with their wives beyond the sexual relationship. These husbands would spend their time with their male friends or at their clubs. These husbands would come home late and would show little interest in what their wives had been doing. A wife who had married a kind and attentive husband might have a relatively happy marriage. The wife would feel respected and valued. The wife would feel that her husband cared about her and about her well-being. A wife who had married a harsh or neglectful husband might have a miserable marriage. The wife would feel disrespected and undervalued. The wife would feel that her husband did not care about her. However, even in the best cases, the wife was still subordinate to the husband. Even a kind husband had the right to make decisions for the wife without consulting her. Even a kind husband had the right to sexual relations with his wife. Even a kind husband had control of the money. The power imbalance in the marriage meant that the wife was always vulnerable. The wife was dependent on the husband's goodwill. The wife had no legal protection if the husband treated her poorly. A wife could not leave the marriage without losing everything. A wife could not threaten to leave because the threat would not be credible. The wife would not be able to survive without the husband's financial support. The wife was trapped. Many Victorian men engage in relationships outside of marriage. A man might have a mistress. A man might keep a woman as a lover, paying for her housing and her support in exchange for sexual relations. Some men would maintain these relationships for years or even for decades. The mistress would be a woman who was not respectable, who could not hope to be married because she had been sexually compromised. Some men would visit brothels. These were establishments where prostitutes worked. A man could go to a brothel and could pay for sexual relations with a woman. This was a normal part of male life in Victorian society. A man was expected to have some sexual experience before marriage. After marriage, a man might continue to seek sexual relations outside of marriage. The wife was expected to tolerate her husband's infidelity with grace and without complaint. Infidelity by the husband was considered to be a normal part of male behavior. Society was largely accepting of male infidelity. Women were told that this was how men were, that men had sexual needs that they could not control, that women should accept this. However, infidelity by the wife was considered to be a grave offense. A wife who was unfaithful would bring shame on the family. A wife who was unfaithful would be condemned. The double standard was stark. A husband could pursue relationships outside of marriage without serious consequence. A wife who did the same would be condemned as a fallen woman. A wife who was unfaithful might be divorced, might lose custody of her children, might be cast out of society. A wife who discovered or suspected that her husband was unfaithful would experience intense emotional pain. The wife would feel betrayed and hurt. The wife would question the husband's love for her. The wife would wonder if she was not enough, if she was not attractive enough, if she had failed in some way. However, the wife would have no recourse. The wife could not confront the husband about his infidelity without risking his anger. If the wife brought up the subject, the husband might become angry. The husband might accuse the wife of being jealous or irrational. If the wife did confront the husband, the wife would be blamed for upsetting the household. The wife would be told that she was being unreasonable. Some wives would spend years not knowing for certain whether their husbands were unfaithful, but suspecting it based on late nights away from home, mysterious activities, and emotional distance. The suspicion and the uncertainty would create a climate of emotional pain in the marriage. The wife would lie awake at night wondering where her husband was and what he was doing. The wife would wonder if he was with another woman. Some wives became very jealous. A wife might become suspicious of any woman with whom the husband spent time. A wife might question the husband's whereabouts and his activities. However, the wife's jealousy would often be met with anger and dismissal from the husband. The husband would tell the wife that she was being unreasonable and irrational. Some husbands would actually flaunt their infidelity or would be deliberately cool about it. A husband might bring his mistress into social situations where the wife would see her. A husband might make remarks that made it clear that he was more interested in another woman. The emotional cruelty of such behavior would be devastating to the wife. The wife would be humiliated in front of her peers. The wife would be made to feel inadequate and rejected. Some wives would become resigned to the infidelity. The wife would accept that this was how marriages were and would try not to think about it. The wife would try to ignore the signs of infidelity and would focus on her children and her household duties. Other wives would suffer intensely from the knowledge or suspicion of infidelity. These wives would develop depression or anxiety. These wives would lose weight or would become physically ill. The infidelity and the emotional pain that it caused was one of the sources of unhappiness in many Victorian marriages. The wife had no way to change the situation and no way to escape the emotional pain. The constraints and stresses of Victorian marriage had severe consequences for women's health. The repeated pregnancies took a physical toll on women's bodies. A woman who had borne 10 or 12 children would be physically damaged. The cumulative effect of repeated pregnancy and childbirth would be devastating. By middle age, a woman who had borne many children might be in poor health. The woman would be exhausted. The woman would be weak. The woman would be prone to various illnesses. The physical work involved in managing a household, particularly in working-class families where the wife did much of the labor herself, resulted in physical deterioration. The stress and the emotional difficulty of marriage contributed to mental health problems. Women in unhappy marriages develop more illness than women in happy marriages. The stress of being subordinate, of having no autonomy, of being trapped in a situation from which there was no escape, this stress took a physical toll. Some women developed nervous conditions. A nervous condition was a diagnosis that covered a range of symptoms, including anxiety, depression, and various physical symptoms. A woman with a nervous condition might suffer from palpitations. Her heart would race. She might feel her heart beating irregularly. The woman would be frightened by these physical symptoms. She might suffer from headaches. The headaches might be constant or might come and go. The headaches might be severe. She might feel weakness and general exhaustion. She might feel as though she did not have the energy to get out of bed. She might have difficulty completing her household duties. She might have difficulty concentrating. She might find it hard to remember things or to think clearly. She might become bedridden and might be unable to fulfill her duties as a wife and mother. The cause of nervous conditions was often attributed to the woman's fragile constitution. Physicians would suggest that women were naturally more nervous than men. Physicians would suggest that the woman was imagining her symptoms or was exaggerating them. However, the nervous conditions were often a response to the stress and the emotional strain of the woman's life. The nervous condition was a woman's body's way of expressing the distress that her mind could not voice. Some women developed hysteria. Hysteria was a diagnosis used to describe various emotional and physical symptoms in women. A woman with hysteria might suffer from paralysis. A woman might lose the ability to use her legs or her arms. A woman might suffer from numbness or loss of sensation in parts of her body. A woman might experience emotional outbursts or fits. The symptoms of hysteria were dramatic and were difficult to ignore. A woman with hysteria might attract attention, might be taken seriously, but the cause was not understood. Physicians attributed hysteria to problems with a woman's reproductive system. The physician might suggest that the woman needed to marry or, if she was already married, that she needed to have children. Some women develop severe depression. A woman might become withdrawn and apathetic. A woman might lose interest in activities and in life. A woman might lose interest in her children and in her household duties. A woman might sleep excessively. A woman might lie in bed for hours. A woman might stop getting dressed or caring for her appearance. A woman might become suicidal. Some women thought about ending their lives. Some women attempted suicide. Some women developed physical symptoms, including gastrointestinal problems, pain, headaches, and various other ailments. The symptoms might not have an organic cause. There might be nothing physically wrong with the woman, but the symptoms would be real. The woman would experience real pain and real distress. Some women became addicted to alcohol or to medications. A woman might take laudanum, which was a solution of opium and alcohol. Laudanum was used for various purposes, including pain relief and treating various ailments. A woman might use laudanum to numb her emotional pain. The medications would be addictive. A woman would develop a dependence on the medication. The woman would need to take larger and larger doses to achieve the desired effect. A woman who became dependent on alcohol or on medications would find it very difficult to break the dependence. The woman would find herself unable to function without the substance. Some women develop eating disorders. A woman might eat too little. A woman might lose weight and might become very thin. A woman might refuse to eat. Or a woman might eat too much. A woman might gain weight and might become very heavy. The eating disorder might be a manifestation of the woman's emotional distress. The eating disorder might be one of the few ways that the woman could exercise control in her life. The health consequences of marriage were particularly severe for women who were unhappy in their marriages. A woman who was trapped in an unhappy marriage would experience ongoing stress and emotional pain. The physical health of a woman would be affected by the emotional stress. A woman who was chronically stressed would be more susceptible to illness. A woman who was unhappy would be more likely to develop physical symptoms. Women who survived their marriages to old age would often have developed chronic health conditions. The physical toll of years of stress, hard work, repeated pregnancy, and emotional pain will be evident in the woman's declining health. An elderly woman who had been married for 50 years might look far older than her chronological age. The woman's face might be lined and worn. The woman's body might be bent and broken. The marriage had taken its toll. In theory, divorce was an option for a woman in an unhappy marriage. In practice, divorce was almost impossible and was socially scandalous. In England, until 1857, divorce was extraordinarily difficult to obtain. Divorce required an Act of Parliament. This meant that only the very wealthy could afford to seek a divorce. A man of significant wealth and status might be able to obtain a divorce. But even a wealthy man would face social consequences. A woman, no matter how wealthy, would have extreme difficulty obtaining a divorce. The process was designed to protect men's interests and to maintain women's subordination. After 1857, divorce became slightly more accessible through the courts, but it was still expensive and was still difficult to obtain. A wife could petition for divorce on the grounds of cruelty or desertion. However, the wife would have to prove these charges. The wife would have to provide evidence. The wife would have to go through a very public and humiliating process. The wife might have to testify in court about the abuse she had suffered. The wife might have to describe the husband's infidelity or his cruelty in front of strangers. Even if a wife was granted a divorce, the wife would face severe social consequences. A divorced woman would be ostracized by society. A divorced woman would not be welcome in polite society. Respectable people would not associate with a divorced woman. The divorced woman would be considered to be disreputable. A divorced woman would have difficulty finding work or supporting herself. If the wife had been educated and might have hoped to work as a governess or a teacher, the divorce would eliminate that possibility. A divorced woman would not be hired as a governess. A divorced woman would not be allowed to teach children. A divorced woman might have limited contact with her children after the divorce. The father would often retain custody of the children. The mother might be allowed to see the children occasionally, but the children would live with the father. The loss of her children would be devastating to a mother. The stigma of divorce was so severe that most women would endure an unhappy or even a cruel marriage rather than face the consequences of divorce. A legal separation was an alternative to divorce. A woman could obtain a legal separation, which would allow her to live apart from her husband, but the marriage would not be dissolved. Even a legal separation carried significant stigma and would have negative consequences for the woman. A separated woman would be viewed with suspicion. The separated woman might not be fully accepted in society. If the wife wanted to remarry after a legal separation, she could not do so. The wife would be bound to her first husband forever. Some women would attempt to leave their husbands and would attempt to live separately without a legal divorce or separation. However, this would leave the woman in a precarious legal and social position. A woman who left her husband without a legal separation would be committing a grave social transgression. The woman would be condemned as a fallen woman. The woman would have no legal rights to any property. The woman would have no claim on her husband's support. The woman would have to find some way to support herself. If the woman had children, the children would remain in the husband's custody by law. The husband could determine if the woman could see the children. The woman might be denied access to her own children. The children would belong to the father. The wife had no legal rights as the mother. In practice, most women in unhappy marriages simply endured the marriage. A woman would stay in the marriage even if she was miserable. A woman would stay in the marriage even if she was being treated poorly. A woman would stay in the marriage because the alternative was worse. The alternative was poverty and social ostracism. The alternative was losing her children. The alternative was destitution. Some women would fantasize about escaping the marriage. Some women would dream about divorce or about their husband's death. The wife might think, if only my husband would die, I could be free. But these would remain fantasies. The woman would continue to live out the role of wife, even if the marriage was unhappy or painful. The difficulty of escape from marriage meant that many women were trapped in unhappy, painful, or even abusive marriages. Domestic violence was common in Victorian marriages, but it was not discussed openly. It was a hidden reality. Violence by a husband toward a wife was not considered to be a crime. It was not illegal. A husband had the right to physically discipline his wife if he believed it was necessary. The concept of marital rape did not exist. A husband could not be prosecuted for forcing his wife to have sexual relations. The law did not recognize that a husband could rape his wife. A wife had no legal protection against her husband's violence. Physical abuse by a husband might include hitting. A man might punch his wife. A man might slap his wife. A man might kick his wife. A man might push his wife around. Verbal abuse might include insults and humiliation. A man might tell his wife that she was stupid or ugly. A man might tell his wife that no one else would want her. Verbal abuse might include threats. A man might threaten to leave the wife. A man might threaten to take the children away. A man might threaten to harm the wife or the children. A wife who was being abused had very limited options. She could not call the police because the violence was not illegal. The police would not help her. She could not obtain a protective order. The law did not provide protection for battered wives. She could not leave the marriage without losing everything. Some wives would endure the abuse for years or even for the rest of their lives. The wife would have no way to escape. Some wives would develop ways of coping with the abuse. Some wives would try to anticipate what would make the husband angry and would try to avoid those situations. A wife might learn not to speak unless spoken to. A wife might learn to be very quiet and very obedient. A wife might attempt to appease the husband. If the wife sensed that the husband was becoming angry, the wife might try to do something that would please him. Some wives would fight back or would confront the husband about his behavior. However, this might result in more severe abuse. A husband who was confronted about his violence might respond by becoming even more violent. The husband might hurt the wife more severely. Some wives would become withdrawn and depressed as a result of the abuse. Some wives would develop physical symptoms or mental health problems. The abuse was often hidden from the outside world. The wife would hide bruises or injuries. The wife would make excuses for the husband's behavior. The wife might tell people that she had fallen or that she had hurt herself. The wife might make up stories to explain the visible signs of abuse. Society was often complicit in the abuse. If the wife tried to leave or tried to get help, she would be told that she should try harder to be a good wife. She would be told that she should be more submissive. The abuse would be blamed on the wife. People would say that the wife must have provoked the husband. People would say that the wife must have done something to deserve the abuse. A wife's family might not help her escape. The family might believe that she should try to make the marriage work. The family might believe that leaving the marriage was worse than enduring the abuse. Some wives would reach a point where they could no longer endure the abuse. Some wives would attempt to poison their husbands. Some wives would attempt to harm their husbands in other ways. Some wives would commit suicide as a way of escaping the abuse. The domestic violence was one of the most tragic aspects of Victorian marriage. Women who were trapped in abusive marriages had virtually no way to escape. The abuse was hidden. The abuse was socially condoned. The abuse was legal. The wife had no protection and no way out. Despite all the constraints and the difficulties of marriage, many Victorian women found profound meaning and deep joy in their children. Children were a central focus of a married woman's life. The birth of a child was celebrated. The family was delighted to have a new member. The birth of a son was celebrated with particular enthusiasm because a son would inherit the family's property and would continue the family line. The birth of a daughter was also celebrated, though the celebration might be somewhat less enthusiastic. A Victorian mother would develop intense emotional bonds with her children. A mother would love her children deeply and would be devoted to their welfare. A mother would feel that her children were the most important part of her life. A mother's life would be organized around the needs and the well-being of her children. However, the relationship between mother and child in a Victorian household was often mediated by nurses and governesses. In a wealthy household, the children would be primarily cared for by servants. A mother might see her children only for a brief period each day. The mother would visit the nursery in the morning or in the afternoon. The mother would have a short time with the children before turning them back over to the care of the nurse. The mother would be removed from the daily care of the children. The mother would not be changing the children's diapers or feeding them or bathing them or putting them to bed. Some mothers found this arrangement to be acceptable. The mother did not have to do the physically demanding labor of caring for young children, but the mother could maintain a relationship with the children. Other mothers found the separation from their children to be painful. Some mothers wanted to spend more time with their children and wanted to be more involved in their daily care. In a smaller household or in a working-class household, the mother would be more directly involved in the care of the children. The mother would do much or all of the physical care. The mother would be with the children throughout the day. The mother would care for them when they were sick. The mother would discipline them when necessary. This more direct involvement would create a different kind of relationship between mother and child. The mother and child would spend more time together. The bond would be forged through daily interaction. Regardless of class, a mother was responsible for the moral and spiritual training of the children. The mother was supposed to teach the children right and wrong. The mother was supposed to instill proper values in the children. A mother was responsible for the character development of her children. If the children misbehaved or if the children developed bad character, the mother would be blamed. The birth of a son was particularly important because the son would inherit the family property and would continue the family line. A mother would be particularly invested in her son's futures. A mother would want her sons to be successful and respectable. The birth of a daughter was also important, but in a different way. A mother would be particularly invested in her daughter's marriageability. A mother would make sure that her daughters were properly educated in the skills and knowledge that would attract husbands. A mother would teach her daughters how to be good wives. A mother's goal for her daughters was often to marry them to men of high status or wealth. A mother might feel that her own status and happiness depended on her daughters' marriages. If a daughter married well, the mother would feel successful. If a daughter failed to marry or married beneath her station, the mother would feel that she had failed. A mother's love for her children was often the primary source of meaning and purpose in a Victorian woman's life. The woman might not have had great love for her husband. The woman might have been unhappy in her marriage. But the woman's love for her children was genuine and profound. However, the birth of children also tied a woman more firmly to her marriage and to her domestic role. A woman who had children would be even less able to escape an unhappy marriage. If the woman left the marriage, she would lose her children. The children would belong to the father. So a woman would stay in an unhappy marriage because she did not want to be separated from her children. The motherhood, while often a source of deep joy and profound meaning, also deepened the constraints and the subordination of the Victorian wife. Despite all the constraints and the difficulties, many Victorian women found ways to exercise agency and to resist the subordination that marriage entailed. They were not simply passive victims of their circumstances. They were active agents trying to navigate their lives and to create meaning. Some women use their position as mothers to exercise influence. A woman might use her influence over her children to shape their values and their behavior in ways that the husband might not approve of. A woman might teach her children to question authority or to think for themselves. A woman might raise her children with values that were different from the father's values. Some women use their social position to support causes that they cared about. A woman might volunteer for charity. A woman might work to help poor women or to address social problems. Some women use their role as manager of the household to exercise a degree of autonomy. A woman who controlled the household finances might have more power than it appeared. A woman might make small decisions about the household without consulting the husband. Some women would refuse to participate in certain social activities. A woman might not want to attend a particular social event, and she might insist on her own preference even if the husband wanted her to attend. Some women would engage in intellectual pursuits that the husband did not approve of. A woman might read books or participate in discussions about ideas despite the husband's disapproval. A woman might read literature or history or politics. A woman might discuss these ideas with other women. Some women would form close friendships with other women and would find emotional support and validation in these friendships. A woman might confide in a close female friend about her unhappiness or her struggles. Some women would develop romantic feelings for other women. These relationships, whether or not they were sexual, were important sources of emotional connection and validation. Some women would engage in affairs or would form emotional attachments to men other than their husbands. In doing so, the woman would assert her right to emotional connection and intimacy. An affair would be a dangerous transgression. If discovered, the woman would face severe consequences. But some women took the risk. Some women would attempt to leave their marriages or would legally separate from their husbands despite the severe social stigma. Some women would refuse to have more children despite the expectation that they would. A woman might use various methods to prevent pregnancy. A woman might refuse sexual relations with her husband. Some women would pursue education or would develop skills despite the expectation that they would be primarily focused on domestic duties. Some women would write or would engage in creative pursuits. A woman might write poetry or fiction or essays. A woman might write about her thoughts and her feelings. Some women would engage in political activity or activism, despite the expectation that women should not involve themselves in politics. A woman might become involved in the women's suffrage movement. A woman might become an activist for women's rights. Some women would challenge the ideologies that justify their subordination. A woman might question why she should be subject to her husband. A woman might question why women could not vote. A woman might question why women could not own property. The ways that women exercised agency were often small and were often invisible to the outside world. But these acts of resistance and agency demonstrated that women were not passive victims of their circumstances. Women found ways to assert themselves, to exercise control over their own lives within the constraints of marriage. Women were resilient and resourceful. A woman who spent a lifetime in marriage would experience significant physical and emotional changes over the years. A young bride, perhaps starting at age 20, would come into marriage with youth and energy. The young woman would have a slim figure. The young woman would have clear skin and bright eyes. The young woman would have strength and vitality. But over the years of marriage, the woman would age and would physically deteriorate. The constant hard work of managing a household would cause wear and tear on the body. The woman would develop aches and pains. By middle age, the woman might suffer from chronic pain. The woman would develop arthritis or rheumatism. The woman's joints would become stiff and painful. The woman would develop respiratory problems or digestive problems. The woman's health would decline gradually. The repeated pregnancies would have left lasting damage. The woman's body would be worn out. The woman would be exhausted. The poor diet and the difficult living conditions would take their toll. By middle age, a woman who had borne many children might be in poor health. A woman might become malnourished or might develop vitamin deficiencies. The woman might become more susceptible to illness as she aged. The mental and emotional impact of years of constraint and subordination would also be significant. A woman who had spent decades being treated as subordinate would have absorbed the message that she was not important or valued. Some women would develop a sense of resignation and acceptance. The woman would accept that this was her lot in life and would not struggle against the difficulties. Other women would struggle with feelings of bitterness and resentment. A woman might regret the choices that had led to decades of service to her husband and her children. A woman might regret the opportunities that had been missed. A woman might think about what her life could have been if she had not married. What would she have done? What would she have accomplished? What would she have become? Some women would develop psychological problems from the stress and the strain of decades of marriage. A woman might experience depression or anxiety. As a woman aged, the woman might become less physically able to handle the work of the household. An older woman might move to lighter tasks or might rely more on servants. By the time a woman reached old age, the woman would have spent the majority of her life in marriage. The woman would have experienced the world from the perspective of a wife. The woman would have internalized the messages about her place in society and would have accepted her subordinate status. Some elderly women would have regrets about their lives. Some would feel that their lives had been wasted. Others would feel that they had done their duty and had contributed to their households and their families. Some elderly women would look back on their marriages with satisfaction. They would feel that they had been good wives and mothers. They would feel that their marriages had been worth the sacrifice. Other elderly women would look back with regret or with bitterness. They would wish they had done things differently. They would wish they had been able to pursue their own interests. They would wish they had had more freedom. For many Victorian women, widowhood provided an opportunity for freedom and independence that had not been possible during their marriages. The death of a husband would end the marriage. The wife would be a widow, no longer subject to the husband's authority. Upon the death of a husband, a widow would have control of her own legal affairs if she was not subject to a will that gave control to a male relative or to adult children. A widow would not have a husband to control her spending or to make decisions for her. A widow could make her own choices about how to live her life. Some widows chose to remain unmarried and to maintain their independence. A widow would not be expected to remarry. Society would accept that a widow might prefer to remain alone. Some widows would take control of family businesses or property. A widow might manage the family estate or the family business. Some widows would move to different places or would establish new lives for themselves. A widow might travel or might relocate to a place she wanted to live. Some widows would become involved in social causes or in volunteer work. A widow might donate money to charity or might work for a cause she believed in. Some widows experience widowhood as a liberation. After years or decades of being subject to the authority of a husband, the widow would finally have control over her own life. The freedom would be exhilarating. The widow would be able to make decisions without consulting anyone. The widow would be able to spend time as she chose. However, widowhood also brought challenges. A widow might have limited resources, depending on what her husband had left her. If the husbands will left the bulk of the estate to the sons, the widow might be left with only a small amount. The widow might have to live modestly. A widow who was left with inadequate resources might struggle financially. The widow would have to be careful with her money. A widow without children or without family to support her might face poverty. The widow would have to find some way to support herself. A widow who had been dependent on her husband for many years might not have the skills to manage finances or to make major decisions. The widow would have to learn. Some widows who have been in unhappy marriages would feel relief at being freed from the marriage. The widow would feel that a burden had been lifted. Other widows would grieve the loss of their husbands. Even if the marriage had not been perfect, the wife might have developed affection for her husband over the years. The widow would mourn. Many widows express a view that widowhood was better than marriage. A widow might say that she valued her independence more than she would have valued a new marriage. A widow who had experienced an unhappy or abusive marriage would particularly value her freedom. The widow would not want to return to a situation of subordination. However, a widow faced social pressure to remarry. Society expected that a widow would eventually marry again. Remarriage would provide financial security. Remarriage would restore the widow to a subordinate position, but it would also provide protection and support. Some widows resisted this pressure and remained unmarried. A widow who had been in an unhappy marriage and who had achieved financial independence would often choose not to remarry. A widow who had been widowed in her later years might not be expected to remarry. An elderly widow would be allowed to remain unmarried. Widowhood demonstrated that women were capable of managing their own affairs and making their own decisions. The independence and autonomy that a widow could experience showed that women were capable of much more than society had allowed them during their marriages. There was a massive gap between what Victorian society claimed about marriage and what marriage was actually like. Victorian society presented a very specific ideology about marriage. According to this ideology, marriage was a partnership based on love, respect, and mutual support. Marriage was supposed to be a source of happiness and fulfillment for both husband and wife. According to the ideology, a good marriage consisted of a loving husband and a devoted wife who worked together to create a happy household. The partners would support each other. The partners would grow together. This ideology was presented in literature, in sermons, in advice books, in the conversations of respectable people. However, the reality of marriage for many women was very different from this ideal. The reality often involved a husband who was distant, authoritarian, or unkind. The reality often involved a wife who was unhappy or who was being treated poorly. The reality often involved little companionship or emotional connection between husband and wife. The ideology emphasized the importance of marital harmony and happiness. However, the structures and the laws of marriage often made harmony and happiness impossible. A wife who was subject to her husband's control and who had no legal rights could not be a true partner. A wife who had no power in the relationship could not participate in decisions about her own life. The ideology claimed that women were naturally suited to the domestic sphere and that they found fulfillment in managing a household and raising children. However, many women found the domestic sphere to be constraining and limiting. Many women wanted more freedom and more opportunities. Many women wanted to pursue their own interests and develop their own talents. The ideology claimed that a wife's duty was to obey her husband and to make him happy. According to the ideology, a virtuous wife would find fulfillment in serving her husband. However, many women resented being required to be subservient. Many women wanted equality and autonomy. The ideology claimed that motherhood was a source of profound joy and fulfillment for women. While some women did find joy in motherhood, other women found the responsibility of motherhood to be burdensome. Some women struggled with the expectations placed on them as mothers. Some women resented the endless work that motherhood entailed. The ideology claimed that marriage was a state of natural bliss and happiness. However, the reality was that many marriages were unhappy, difficult, and constraining. Some marriages were destructive and abusive. The gap between the ideology and the reality was enormous. The ideology presented a picture of marriage that bore little resemblance to the actual experience of many Victorian women. The ideology served to justify and to perpetuate the subordination of women. If marriage was supposed to be a state of bliss, then a woman who was unhappy in her marriage must be at fault. If marriage was supposed to be a source of fulfillment, then a woman who did not find fulfillment must be ungrateful or must have character flaws. The ideology prevented women from recognizing that the problem might not be with themselves, but with the structures and the laws of marriage itself. Women internalized the ideology. Women believed what they had been told about marriage. When their actual experience did not match the ideology, women blamed themselves. To understand what marriage was really like, we need to look at the real experiences of real women. One woman we might call Sarah married at age 23 to a man she barely knew. The marriage was arranged by her parents. Sarah had no choice in the matter. Sarah's husband was a successful businessman, but he was cold and distant. He spent most of his time away from home conducting business. He showed little interest in Sarah as a person. He returned home in the evening, but would often be withdrawn and uncommunicative. He would eat dinner and then would retire to his study. He showed little interest in how Sarah's day had been or in what Sarah was thinking or feeling. The sexual relations between Sarah and her husband were mechanical and impersonal. Her husband would come to her bedroom occasionally, would have relations with her, and would leave. It was not intimate or affectionate. Sarah bore 4 children in 6 years. The pregnancies were difficult, and her health deteriorated with each pregnancy. By the time she was 30, Sarah looked much older than her years. Her face was lined. Her body was worn. Sarah felt isolated and lonely in her marriage. She had no one to talk to about her unhappiness. Her mother was not sympathetic. Her mother believed that Sarah should simply accept her fate and be a good wife. Sarah tried to be a good wife. She managed the household efficiently. She was a devoted mother to her children. She was an adequate hostess when her husband needed to entertain. But Sarah felt that nothing she did was ever good enough. Her husband showed no appreciation for her efforts. Her husband showed no affection for her. Sarah developed what was diagnosed as a nervous condition. She suffered from headaches and weakness. She often felt anxious. She had difficulty sleeping. At age 45, Sarah's husband died suddenly. Sarah was initially devastated by the loss. But as time passed, Sarah realized that she felt relieved. Sarah was left with property and some money. For the first time in her life, Sarah had independence. Sarah used her newfound independence to travel. She visited places she had always wanted to see. She traveled to Italy and to France. Sarah used her independence to pursue interests that she had suppressed during her marriage. Sarah wrote poetry. She had always had a talent for writing, but her husband had not approved. Now she was free to write. Sarah joined a literary circle where she could discuss books and ideas with other educated women. Sarah said later that the happiest years of her life were the years after her husband's death. Widowhood gave her the freedom that she had never experienced during her marriage. Another woman we might call Margaret married for love. Margaret and her husband were genuinely devoted to each other, and their marriage was affectionate and happy compared to many Victorian marriages. Margaret and her husband spent time together. They enjoyed each other's company. They discussed books and ideas. However, even in this happy marriage, Margaret experienced the constraints of the system. Margaret's property became her husband's when she married. Margaret could not make financial decisions without her husband's consent. Margaret's husband was kind and respected her opinion, but he still had final say in all major decisions. Margaret bore 6 children and experienced the physical and emotional toll of repeated pregnancy and childbirth. Despite the kindness of her husband, Margaret felt the weight of the expectations placed on her. She was responsible for the household, for the children, and for the social life of the family. Margaret did not resent her husband, but she sometimes wished that she had more autonomy and more freedom. She wished she could pursue her own interests more fully. Another woman we might call Emma married a man who became abusive. Early in the marriage, Emma's husband would fly into rages and would hit her. Emma was frightened and confused. She had been raised to believe that a wife should obey her husband. She had been taught that marriage was a duty. Emma tried to change her behavior to prevent the abuse. She tried to anticipate what would anger her husband and would try to avoid those situations. But the abuse continued. Her husband would hit her for minor offenses or for no reason at all. Emma tried to leave the marriage. She went to stay with her parents, but her parents refused to help her. They believed that she should try to make the marriage work. They believed that leaving the marriage was dishonorable. Emma's father contacted her husband, and arranged for her to return to him. Emma remained in the marriage for 35 years. She endured decades of abuse. She was eventually able to leave when her children were grown, but by then she was broken in spirit and in health. Emma suffered from chronic health problems. She suffered from depression. She had difficulty trusting people. She had difficulty believing that she deserved to be treated with kindness. These stories illustrate the different experiences that Victorian women had in marriage. Some marriages were unhappy but tolerable. Some marriages were genuinely happy. Some marriages were abusive and destructive. In all cases, the wife was subject to constraints and limitations that the husband did not face. We can learn about the interior lives of Victorian women by reading what they wrote. Diaries, letters, and autobiographies from Victorian women provide insights into their experiences of marriage. Many Victorian women wrote about their unhappiness in marriage. A woman might write in her diary about her loneliness, her frustration, or her despair. One woman wrote, "I feel as though I'm drowning in this marriage. I wake each morning and wonder how I will endure another day of this." Another woman wrote, "My husband scarcely looks at me. He has no interest in my thoughts or my feelings. I am merely the manager of his household." A woman might write about the difficulty of the marital duty. A woman might write about her fear and revulsion at her husband's sexual advances. One woman wrote, "I dread the night when he comes to my bed. My entire body tenses. I feel as though I am being violated. Yet I have no choice. This is my duty as a wife." A woman might write about her resentment at being subject to her husband's control. A woman might write about her desire for more freedom and more autonomy. One woman wrote, "I am a prisoner in my own home. I cannot go where I wish. I cannot do what I wish. I must ask permission for the smallest things. I am not a person. I am a possession." Some women wrote about their love for their husbands despite the constraints of the marriage. Some women expressed the view that they loved their husbands even though the marriage was difficult. One woman wrote, "I do love my husband, and yet I feel such sadness that our marriage is not all that I had hoped it would be." Some women wrote about their love for other women. These writings suggest that some women formed emotional attachments to women that went beyond what would be considered friendship. One woman wrote, "My greatest happiness comes from my friendship with Catherine. She understands me in a way that no one else does. With her, I can be myself." Some women wrote about their regrets about marriage. A woman might write that she wished she had not married, or that she wished she had married a different man. One woman wrote, "If I could live my life again, I would not marry. I would live my own life and would pursue my own interests." Some women wrote about their dreams and aspirations that they had to give up when they married. One woman wrote, "I had wanted to be a writer, but my husband forbade it. He said it was unseemly. Now I am 50 years old, and I have never written anything. That dream is gone." Some women wrote about the conflict between their authentic selves and the self that they had to perform as wives. One woman wrote, "I feel as though I am living a lie. The person that everyone sees is not who I am. The real me is hidden away. I dare not reveal her." The writings of Victorian women show us that they were aware of their circumstances, that they thought about their situations, and that they had complex feelings and reactions to their lives. The writings show us that women were not content to be passive and subordinate, but were actively thinking about their lives and their circumstances. The writings provide a counter-narrative to the ideology that presented marriage as uniformly happy and fulfilling. The study of Victorian marriage teaches us important lessons that extend beyond the historical period itself. First, we learn about the human cost of inequality. The Victorian system of marriage subordinated women and caused them suffering. By studying this suffering, we are reminded of the importance of equality and justice. Second, we learn about resilience and dignity. Despite severe constraints, women found ways to maintain their dignity and create meaning in their lives. This teaches us about human capacity to endure and to resist. Third, we learn about the importance of recognizing women's voices and experiences. Victorian women were often silent or were not believed, but their experiences and their suffering were real. Learning to listen to women's voices is important. Fourth, we learn about the importance of women's rights and women's autonomy. The fact that it took so long for women to gain basic legal rights and autonomy shows how deep the subordination was. Fifth, we learn about the ways that ideology can justify injustice. The Victorian ideology about women and marriage was designed to make subordination seem natural and inevitable. Understanding this helps us recognize similar ideologies in our own time. 6. We learn that progress is not inevitable. The rights that women have today were not granted automatically. They were won through struggle and activism. The reforms that were won during and after the Victorian era, the Married Women's Property Acts, the reforms in divorce law, the expansion of women's education, women's right to vote, were all fought for by people who recognized the injustice of the system. Women had to organize and had to demand their rights. They had to challenge the ideology that justified their subordination. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 was the first recognition that married women should have some control over their own property. This was revolutionary. For the first time, the law recognized that wives should not be completely subordinate to their husbands. But even this act was limited. It did not give wives complete equality. It did not give wives the right to vote or to hold public office. The fight for women's rights continued throughout the late Victorian era and into the 20th century. Women in the 20th century would continue the fight for equality. Women would demand the right to vote. Women would demand equal access to education and to professions. The legacy of Victorian marriage reminds us that we must continue to work toward creating a more just and more equal world. The legacy reminds us of the importance of recognizing the dignity and the worth of all people. We have now completed our comprehensive journey through what marriage was really like for Victorian women. We have understood the legal system that subordinated women. We have understood the social expectations that constrained women. We have understood the personal experiences of women in marriage. We have learned about the physical, emotional, and psychological consequences of marriage for women. We have learned about the ways that women resisted their subordination and exercised agency within the constraints they faced. We have learned that women were not passive victims, but were thinking, feeling, intelligent people who tried to create lives of meaning and dignity within difficult circumstances. We have honored the experiences and the stories of Victorian women by studying their lives carefully and by recognizing their humanity and their worth. By understanding the reality of Victorian marriage, we understand something important about the history of women, about the history of society, and about the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. The Victorian women endured what we would now recognize as a profoundly unjust system. They endured legal subordination, physical vulnerability, emotional isolation, and constraint. Some of them escaped through widowhood. Some of them found happiness despite the constraints. Some of them resisted actively. Some of them simply endured. All of them deserved better. All of them deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Now, as we bring this journey to a conclusion, let yourself become increasingly relaxed and ready for sleep. Your body is becoming very heavy and very relaxed. Every muscle is releasing tension. Your entire body is finding peace. Your mind is becoming very quiet. All the stories are gently fading. All the information is settling into memory. You are sinking deeper into relaxation with each breath. Your breathing is becoming slower and more gentle. Sleep is approaching. Sleep is coming to you. You can feel sleep arriving gently and naturally. There is no effort required. There is no struggle. Sleep comes easily. Your body wants to sleep. Your mind wants to sleep. Everything about you is ready for rest. The Victorian women have been honored. Their stories have been told. Their voices have been heard. You have listened with understanding and compassion. You have recognized their humanity and their struggle. Now you can rest. Now you can sleep. Sleep deeply and peacefully. Sleep without worry. Sleep in safety and comfort. Sleep now, knowing that you have learned important lessons about history, about women, about the human experience. Sleep. Like and subscribe our channel.